What if Edward VIII had not abdicated the British throne? Could Britain and Germany have been allies in World War II? On December 11, 1936, an event unfolded in British history that still sparks debates and stirs the imagination of historians, writers, and ordinary people alike. King Edward VIII, who had reigned for less than a year, made the unprecedented decision to abdicate the throne. The reason was both simple and extraordinary for its time. He chose love for an American woman, Wallis Simpson, over the crown. This act became a sensation because kings don't typically abandon power for personal feelings. But what if he had chosen differently? What if Edward had stayed on the throne, married Wallis, and continued to rule? How might this have altered the course of British, European, and even world history? How it all began, a scandal that rocked Britain. To grasp why Edward VIII's abdication was such a monumental event, we need to rewind to early 1936. On January 20th, King George V, the stern, conservative monarch who had guided the nation through the turbulent years following World War I, passed away. His eldest son, Edward, known as David within the family, inherited the throne and became Edward VIII. At first glance, everything seemed to be proceeding as expected, a new king, a new era. But storm clouds were already gathering over Buckingham Palace. Edward wasn't your typical prince. At 42 years old, he was unmarried and made no secret of his reluctance to conform to the rigid traditions imposed by his family and the British elite. His father, George V, was a man of the old school. He had practically ordered his second son, Albert the future George VI, to marry Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon to secure the dynasty. But Edward wouldn't bend to such pressure. He stubbornly rejected every suitable bride his father proposed. Instead, he fell in love with Wallis Simpson, an American who had already been married twice and divorced once. Wallis wasn't just a foreigner, she came with baggage. Her first marriage to an American naval officer ended in divorce in 1927 due to emotional incompatibility, a reason that British law at the time didn't recognize as valid grounds for ending a marriage. Her second husband, businessman Ernest Simpson, was still married to her when Edward ascended the throne, though their divorce was already in motion. To the British elite and the Anglican Church, this was a nightmare. Divorce was rare in those days, and the idea of a twice-married, once-divorced woman becoming queen was unthinkable. The situation was further complicated by the fact that the British monarch traditionally serves as the head of the Anglican Church. That church forbade divorced individuals from remarrying in a church ceremony while their former spouses were still alive. Both of Wallis's ex-husbands were very much alive, placing Edward in an awkward position. As head of the church, he was expected to uphold its rules, but as a man, he wanted to marry the woman he loved. This clash between duty and desire became the heart of the drama. Why was this a problem? British society in the 1930s was deeply conservative. The elite, parliament, the church, and even the press believed the king should be a model for his subjects, not just in politics, but in his personal life as well. To them, Wallis Simpson embodied everything they despised: an American, a divorcee, independent, and, according to rumors, far from respectable. Newspapers and government ministers painted her as an almost demonic figure. She was accused of spying for Germany, having an affair with German diplomat Joachim von Ribbentrop, later Nazi Germany's foreign minister, plotting to plunder the royal family's wealth, and even using her feminine wiles to bewitch Edward and bend him to her will. The royal family didn't accept Wallis either. George V and his wife, Queen Mary, met her once in 1935 at Buckingham Palace, and the encounter was a disaster. Afterward, they barred her from appearing at court. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin and the leaders of Britain's dominions Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa also opposed the marriage. The only exception was Ireland, which largely ignored the scandal and even officially recognized Edward's abdication a day later than the rest of the United Kingdom. By December 1936, the situation had reached a boiling point. Edward faced a stark choice: abandon Wallis and remain king, or give up the throne for her. He chose the latter. In his famous radio address, he declared, "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king, as I would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman I love." With that, his reign lasting just 325 days came to an end. What if he hadn't abdicated? Now let's imagine an alternative scenario. What if Edward had decided to stay on the throne and marry Wallis despite the uproar? He actually had that option. In November 1936, Prime Minister Baldwin presented him with three choices: abandon the idea of marrying Wallis, abdicate, or marry her against the government's wishes. The third option would have led to the cabinet's resignation, early elections, and potentially a constitutional crisis. But technically, no one could stop Edward from marrying whomever he pleased. The king still had the right to make his own personal decisions. Winston Churchill, then a mere member of parliament without a high-ranking position, supported Edward. He argued that ministers had no right to interfere in the monarch's private life, and that if the matter went to parliament, Edward might well have prevailed. However, Churchill was politically isolated at the time, and his opinion carried little weight. Had Edward chosen this third path, he could have waited for Wallis's divorce from her second husband finalized in May 1937, married her, and then faced the consequences. Most likely, Baldwin's government would have resigned, but that wouldn't have spelled disaster. Britain would have found new ministers to take their place. The irony is that Edward's coronation was scheduled for May 27, 1937. In reality, it went ahead without him, crowning his brother Albert George VI instead. Baldwin stepped down the very next day. Had Edward held on for just a few more months, he might have outlasted his chief opponents and remained king. Britain and Germany allies? Now to the big question: how would this have changed history? Some historians argue that if Edward had stayed on the throne, Britain might have grown closer to Nazi Germany. This theory hinges on Edward's apparent sympathy for Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini. For instance, he openly supported Italy's invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, a bold move by Mussolini that many nations condemned. After his abdication as the Duke of Windsor, Edward and Wallis visited Germany in 1937, where they were warmly received by Hitler and his inner circle. There's even a photograph that appears to show him giving a Nazi salute, though he later insisted he was merely waving. In 1940, during the war, he gave an interview in Portugal hinting that Hitler was unbeatable and Britain was doomed. But let's examine how realistic this is. Britain isn't an absolute monarchy. The king doesn't decide whom to fight, whom to ally with, or how to tax the people. Those powers lie with Parliament and the Prime Minister. Even if Edward wanted an alliance with Germany, he couldn't simply command it. Real authority rested with politicians like Neville Chamberlain, who became Prime Minister in 1937 and pursued a policy of appeasing Germany. Chamberlain signed the Munich Agreement in 1938, handing over part of Czechoslovakia to Hitler to avoid war-proof that Britain's elite was willing to compromise with Germany, even without Edward's influence. That said, the king is a symbol, and his views could sway public opinion. If Edward had openly backed Hitler, it might have bolstered the appeasement faction, those who wanted peace with Germany at any cost. Imagine this: on September 1, 1939, Germany invades Poland, and instead of declaring war 2 days later, as happened in reality, Britain hesitates or opts out entirely. Perhaps Hitler, sensing London's weakness, offers Edward a deal peace in exchange for Britain staying out of European affairs. The entire course of World War II could have shifted. Economic and historical consequences. Let's consider what this might have meant economically and historically. In reality, Britain played a pivotal role in the war against Germany. After France fell in 1940, it stood alone as the only major power resisting the Nazis until the Soviet Union and the United States joined in 1941. The British economy was fully mobilized for war. Factories churned out tanks and planes, women worked in production, and colonies supplied resources. If Britain had stayed neutral or allied with Germany, this mobilization wouldn't have happened. The economy might have avoided massive war spending, but it could have lost its post-war global influence. Historically, an alliance with Germany would mean Britain endorsed the Nazi regime, its racism, aggression, and eventually the Holocaust. This would have dramatically altered the nation's image. After the war, when Nazi atrocities came to light, Britain might have become an international pariah, and its empire from India to Africa could have crumbled even faster. Colonial subjects would hardly want to remain under a power that backed Hitler. On the flip side, peace with Germany might have offered Britain a temporary respite. The 1930s were tough. The Great Depression had left unemployment, poverty, and social unrest in its wake. War, paradoxically, revived the economy by spurring industrial output. Without it, Edward might have focused on domestic reforms. He was known to care about social issues. On tour of the country, he visited impoverished areas and spoke about aiding workers. He could have become a people's king, easing class tensions. What about the monarchy? If Edward had stayed, the British monarchy itself might have evolved differently. His marriage to Wallis would have shattered conservative traditions. In reality, his brother George VI and niece Elizabeth II reinforced the monarchy as a symbol of stability and morality. Edward, however, could have modernized it, making the royal family more relatable. This would have sparked controversy, but might have brought the crown closer to the people. Curiously, the throne would still be Elizabeth II's today. Edward and Wallis had no children, so after his death in 1972, the crown would have passed to his niece. But her reign might have begun under very different circumstances, perhaps with less reverence for the institution. My thoughts and reflections. To me, Edward VIII feels like a man caught between his era and a more modern mindset. He wanted to live life on his terms, not dictated by tradition. His story isn't just about love, it's about fighting for personal freedom. If he'd stayed king, it might have signaled to society that even monarchs are human, not just figureheads. Yet his apparent fondness for Hitler gives me pause. Maybe it was naivety or a desire to avoid another war after the horrors of World War I. But if he'd pushed Britain toward Germany, the consequences could have been disastrous. A world without a strong anti-Hitler coalition might be a world where Nazism triumphed, and that's a chilling thought. Conclusion: Edward VIII's story shows how one person's choice can ripple through the fate of nations. Had he not abdicated, we might live in a very different world. Britain and Germany as allies in World War II isn't just a fantasy, it's a plausible outcome that hinged on one man. Perhaps it's for the best that he chose love and stepped away. Sometimes, relinquishing power is its own kind of strength.